People always say, work smart, not hard. After all, if you're working smart, you don't need to work hard, right? But what if you were to work smart and hard? That's the decision I made in my first year at uni. And it was probably the wisest decision I've made because it helped me earn a scholarship every year during my undergraduate degree at Cambridge, which looks great on a CV, and it also helped me financially throughout my clinical years because the scholarships I earned meant that I received £1,000 a year. So all round, a pretty sweet deal, right? And right about now, you're probably thinking, good for you, mate. But how do I get me one of these deals? How do I even work smart and hard? What does it even mean to work smart and hard? Well, you're in luck, because here's how I did it. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Shane and I'm a recently qualified doctor and neuroscience supervisor at Oxford University. And today I'm going to explain how I achieved my smart, hard mindset, as well as what strategies I used to help me get a triple scholarship at Cambridge. And importantly, how you can apply these strategies to your own life. I'm going to break this down into the smart, the hard, and the ugly. Only joking, the motivation. But first, let's start by looking at what I mean when I say the smart hard mindset. The smart hard mindset is when you buy into a composite of strategies, combining the work smart attitude with the work hard attitude. Working smart will mean that you work efficiently to maximize the value you get from the time you put in. And working hard will mean that you can maximize the volume of work you can do healthily and sustainably. Having a mindset where you subscribe to working both smart and hard will make sure that you have a formidable arsenal of strategies that will help you achieve any goal, no matter how impossible or difficult it might seem. In fact, I had to change a lot of bad habits and mental frameworks to help me form this smart hard mindset. During my first term at university, I worked super hard. I used the techniques from school that had worked for me, things like note-taking and rereading. But the results I had to show for this hard work was quite poor, to say the least. Yes, I was disheartened, but it helped me realize working hard alone wouldn't be enough. So I had to lose those bad non-smart strategies and adopt some new smart ones. But then again, studying smart alone wasn't going to be enough to help me cover the enormous volume of work that was piling up. It's only when I adopted this smart hard mindset and combined the two, I started to see real results and achieved some incredible things. So let's start with the smart. Between myself, Ali Abdal, and 100 other study tubers, you've probably heard the terms active recall and spaced repetition a million times by now. But here's how I took these strategies from the lab setting and applied it practically to my university life. The recurring revision timetable. Sounds fancy, right? But it's just a process of repeating information with varying gaps in between, aka spaced repetition. I applied this strategy to minimize the amount of information I was forgetting from time point A to time point B. To make sense of this, let's take a look at the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. As you can see, as soon as you've learned something, you start forgetting it, and it's greatest at the initial period. So knowing this, I designed the recurring revision timetable. The idea was, after I'd read something for the first time, I'd repeat it the next day, and then again on the weekend. Then finally, I'd repeat it once more at some point next week. By doing this, I was applying the principle of spaced repetition, with the aim of trying to maintain a solid memory during the initial period where I was most vulnerable to loss. Now, if I was following spaced repetition as described in the lab setting, then I would have to revise it in another week's time, and then in 2 weeks' time, and so on. But when you almost have 20 new lectures a week, essays to write, gyms to go to, and people to catch up with, revisiting the same lecture so frequently isn't really possible. And in fact, it can stop you from keeping up to date with the current lectures. So I made a conscious decision to park that topic until the next holiday break in about 6 weeks' time. However, because I'd revised the topic excessively in the initial week and a half of me encountering it, I had a solid core memory resistant to initial loss. So when I came to revisiting it in 6 weeks' time, I had a pretty good memory of it, and it was much easier to bring back the forgotten pieces. Importantly, I kept a track of what I revised and when, and I used this to create a recurring revision timetable that told me what I needed to revise next. Now I know others recommend rating the ease with which something was recalled and using that to guide when you should next repeat it. But personally, I don't do this because I know humans are very poor judges of memory and ease of recall. As a result, it's easy to become overconfident and not visit the things that you judge to be permanent memories. Whereas by sticking to my recurring revision timetable, everything got revisited when its time came, no matter how hard or easy it felt. Having this element of choice and control taken away freed up a lot of my mental resources to focus on plowing on with revision. You can set up a recurring revision timetable however you like, on paper, Google, or Apple Calendar. Just pick a system that works for you and you can be consistent with. Now, it's all good having a system that tells you what to revise when, but how do you actually revise? Well, revising for me used to mean sitting down with a textbook and copying out the main points onto a piece of paper using my own handwriting. Then I would neatly highlight the key points and reread a few times. This system worked great at GCSE and A-levels. So when I came to uni, I thought, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Unfortunately, the reality was that I was doing well at school despite these bad, non-smart strategies. At school, I had plenty of time to use my inefficient strategies and still do well. But at university, my inefficient strategies of making notes blindly meant that I spent little to no time actually mindfully reading the material and taking things in. And because of the high volume of lectures, I had no time to revisit the topic more than once, because the writing was taking up all my time. Of course, these poor techniques caught up with me and I got some shockingly low grades in my mocks. So I decided to make a change and stop making notes. Instead, I switched to mindfully reading the material using cued and free recall. Practically, this would mean that I would read a paragraph, then I would cover it up or look away, and then I'd try to recall as much of the main points as possible. After I achieved a recall of about 80%, then I'd move on and read the next paragraph. After that, I'd cover both the paragraphs I'd read and try to recall the first paragraph again and then the second. I'd repeat this process until I got to the end of the page, after which I'd cover up the whole page and try to recall as much of the information as possible. When I used cues like subheadings, that was cued active recall, and when I covered up the whole page and tried to remember as much information as possible, that was free recall. This whole process meant that I was using active recall and spaced repetition at every page. Of course, this took up a lot of time, and sometimes it'd take me 2 hours just to read one lecture. But overall, this resulted in a solid core initial memory. And I found that the next time I revisited the lecture, I could power through it in half the time, and the next time after that in half the time. And I'd keep halving the time with each repetition. There are reams of studies that show how this whole process helps to improve your overall grades and memory compared to passive reading. It's hard work at the top, but it sets you up quite nicely for the future. Now, the final smart strategy I used to help me improve my grades efficiently was doing past exam questions using the testing effect. In the past, I'd hold off on doing exam questions until I felt that I had read and learnt the material well enough. Holding on to this attitude during my first term meant that I never saw, let alone did, any past exam questions. But in the terms after, I forced myself to look at exam questions as early as possible. One, it helped me focus my reading because I had a rough idea of what main topics get examined and what niche points come up. So I knew which topics were high yield and which were less examinable from early on. And as a result, I'd agonize over things far less. If there had been no past exam questions on it, it's quite likely that the examiners don't believe it's core information. And my time was better spent elsewhere. So skimming past exam questions definitely helped guide my decisions and reduce my anxiety. The second way it helped me was by putting me in an exam mindset from the start. Yes, we're learning for knowledge, but at the end of the day, we are just learning to pass an exam. This whole concept of skimming past exam questions before you start learning something is known as pre-testing. And there's great evidence to show how this improves your memory and grades. But the real bulk of the testing effect gains comes from post-testing. That's when you do past exam questions after you've learned something, and importantly, you mark them to give yourself some feedback. Post-testing combined with feedback helps to improve your objective grade by almost 40%. I'd argue this was the most important smart strategy that helped me to keep my cool and do well in exams. It reduced my subjective anxiety and improved my objective exam scores. Now that we've dealt with the smart half of the mindset, let's turn our attentions to the hard part. The hard part, of course, is putting in the volume of work required to cover everything you need to using the smart strategies. Yes, the smart strategies will maximize your efficiency and is the most high yield thing you can do with your time. But if we don't combine that with the sheer volume of work hours required, we still run into this problem of inadequate and incomplete coverage. This was the biggest challenge for me. I wanted to do well academically, but I also wanted to spend time with my friends and keep up with my hobbies. So I had to create a sustainable timetable that allowed me to cover everything I needed to, but still allowed enough downtime for me to do the work without burning out. To tackle this issue, I created two timetables. The first was designed for sustainability, and the second was designed for intensity. I've already created a video that explained my intensity study routine that was designed for maximum work that I followed a month before exams. And you can find that up here. The sustainable study routine, on the other hand, took into account the fact I had lectures to attend, hobbies that I wanted to keep up with like gymming, and social commitments like chilling with friends and relaxing with family. This sustainable timetable was the one that I followed for most of the year. The main principles I used when creating this timetable was forecasting, operational shifting, and compartmentalisation. Let me explain. Forecasting was the principle of advanced planning. As my consultant says, those who fail to plan, plan to fail. So I would carry out forecasting in 2 stages. The first was the preliminary forecast. I'd sit down on a Sunday evening and plan out what commitments I have for the next week. The first things I put in my calendar were the things that had fixed times. So this would be things like lectures and supervisions. Then based on what lectures I have coming up, I would plan time slots for pre-reading and post-reading, and put this into the calendar in a semi-fixed but flexible manner. I had 3 rules when I was designing these time slots. Pre-reading had to happen the day before a lecture, post-reading had to happen on the day of or latest the day after the lecture, and every lecture had to be pre-read once and post-read at least twice in that week. Then I would factor in time slots flexibly for gymming and chilling with friends. So essentially I put the fixed things in first and designed time slots for the other things more flexibly around it. The sustainable timetable also had to be evolving and able to cope with change. The timetable had to cope with last-minute changes to supervisions and uni lectures, as well as the occasional spontaneous midweek nights out. So really it was a rolling timetable where I would update the preliminary forecast to more accurately reflect what I was going to do the day after on the night before. This I termed the final forecast. The second principle that made my sustainable timetable work was operational shifting. This essentially meant that I would never study the same topic in a row. Say if I revised neuroscience, the next thing I would be studying would be something totally different like pharmacology. And I would always take a purposeful break between each study session instead of diving straight into the next block. A purposeful break could be anything from attending lectures or gymming to eating or showering. This way my attention was renewed for the next block of studying. This feature of operational shifting and purposeful breaks also forms a cornerstone of the intensity study routine, which again you can find up here. The third principle of the sustainable study routine was compartmentalisation, which worked to create hard boundaries between work and play. As a hard rule, after 8 PM on a weekend, I would do no work, and I dedicate that time to relaxing and chilling with friends. I'd also have a day like this kind of midweek or on a Friday evening. Having these hard boundaries and preset relaxation times gave me something to look forward to and work towards. It also helped me totally switch off and relax when I was with my mates instead of thinking about work. This brings us nicely to the glue that holds the smart hard mindset together. So I've told you so far the smart strategies I used, as well as how I created the sustainable and intense study routines that aim to work me hard. But this smart hard mindset required a motivational glue to make sure it stayed together, and I stuck to the timetable and continued to use my smart strategies. To form this motivational glue, I created 3 levels of reward. At the first level were short-term rewards like breaks to go to the gym or see friends for dinner. This motivated me to stick to the sustainable timetable for that day, and kind of around midweek my mind would start to wander and the power of the short-term rewards would falter. That's when I would focus on more intermediate rewards like a bigger chill that would happen on the weekend, or the biggest chill that was to come, the summer holidays. This kept me going throughout the week and up until the midterm point. It's at this point that both the short-term and intermediate term rewards would start to fail once more. That's when I had to use the big guns and start to focus on some longer term goals. I had to focus on what type of person I wanted to become, what I wanted to be known for, and how I was going to get there. I'd focus on role models like people several years above, as well as supervisors I respected. A kind of overall goal that kept me going personally was that I wanted to get a first, and I wanted that triple scholarship over the next 3 years. Not really for anyone else, but basically to prove to myself that I could do it if I applied myself. It was an attempt to prove myself to myself. One thing to take away from this is having personalized overall goals that you truly want can be a massive motivator. Don't do it for your parents, your friends, or anyone else. Make sure you do it for you. And that's probably the healthiest way you can set these kind of goals that's going to help you keep your smart hard mindset glued together. The other main challenge I encountered were distractions. You know that surprise text from your mate saying how the whole block were pre-drinking in 10 minutes time and how it was going to be an epic night out? Well, I was a sucker for these kind of texts. And that was fine because I built in redundancies into this sustainable timetable. Any work I'd missed, I'd just catch up later in the week. However, if I did have a clash, like for example, I hadn't pre-read something that was due to be lectured on tomorrow and there was no other time to do it, then I'd have to exercise some discipline and turn down the motive. I did this because I had predefined prioritizations and I knew exactly what I wanted to achieve by when. i.e. good forecasting and overall goals. But turning things down would rarely be the case, because I'd always ensure the preliminary forecast had lots of redundancies in it, meaning that I wasn't doing things last minute and I had plenty of time for spontaneity. Of course, there's a limit to this, as with anything. To find out more about everything I've talked about, you might like to check out this playlist. But that's it from me for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.